My question is, you spoke about how gentle timing came naturally. You didn't.
Well, I would say it came culturally.
Right.
From my particular culture, which happens to be a culture that I would share with a lot of, students of translation or translators who have backgrounds in Anglophone literatures.
So my question is more about the process. So in terms of the Fanny Hill intertextualities, was that like you would read the Italian and then you would think, I've read something like this in Fanny Hill, I'm going to do a search of the word wound, or how did that work? Was that also came culturally?
Right. No, there were two different methods with this case. With the Wyatt, it truly, in all honesty, just popped into my mind. When I came to Mite, and of course, the possible English equivalents for this word ran through my mind, I thought of Wyatt's poem. With Cleland, that was a more intended construction, in the sense that I noticed that there were certain archaisms, in addition to what I've called the porno cliché in the Italian text. There are certain archaisms that she uses, archaic words in Italian. And eventually I came across, I remembered Cleland's text, which is analogous in a number of ways to Melissa's. And I then sat down and reread Cleland's text and made lists of words, the words he used for genitalia. One of the interesting things about Cleland is that he never uses the same word twice. So it's truly a kind of pornographic dictionary from another point of view, or database, okay? And I looked for opportunities where I could maintain a semantic correspondence and insert some of these archaic / porno cliche-like words. So it was deliberate, and it's something that I've done with other translations, although with other materials, different materials. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for that long, extended sort of meditation on something that it seems to me you've been working with throughout your whole career. It seems to me you're kind of honing that question of domestication and foreignizing of translation in the Translators Agency. I have two comments to make. One is about the ideal reader, and one is more methodological about the premises with which you began your about sort of the state of translation studies as a interdiscipline of whatever we want to call it. The one comment about the ideal reader is that I think, and this is just a little sort of anecdote that I want to add here. At a time of sort of increasing multilingual readerships and increasing sort of reading online, especially, the possibility of having that ideal reader that does do the compare and contrast happens. As an example, I follow an Italian blog about politics, and this Uninomade website has began to publish pieces both in Italian and in English, and there was an interesting Italian review by Tony Negri of Agamben's latest book, translated into English. And myself, as a bilingual reader, I read the English and I'm trying to figure out what the heck is Tony Negri saying about Agamben. And then I had to go, and I saw that there was an Italian version available, and then I realized, all my own intertextual sort of set of Italian my cultural mappings of those implicit intertextual relations that Tony Negri does with Agamben were kind of completely lost in the English. However, in the English, that same kind of thing that was happening with Kate Scopes, with Althusser and Timpanaro, was evident. There was an evident sort of presence of a certain kind of academic language playing in the English Tony Negri, and the English Tony Negri was a very different Tony Negri from the Italian Tony Negri. But that said, sort of I was there, and I'm sure there's an increasing cohort of readers on the internet that can actually do that work of sort of seeing what the translations do. So that's a comment on the question of the ideal reader that is present. The question about methodology, however, is one that I'm really concerned about. I mean, you mentioned the question of we're forgetting the unit of translation. What is the unit of translation? And this array of sociological and sort of navigating between theoricism and empiricism. And I must say, the question is still an open question, and I'm here coming from a perspective, from a literary perspective that, however, is increasingly sort of fascinated with what I want to say, I'm not discounting what is happening in linguistics and what is happening with what seem to be very, at present, very technical set of studies. And I'm thinking here of corpus methodologies and corpus studies on translation, in which, however much they're being mostly and used in Europe and mostly attached to specialized languages, legal studies, medical language, etc. They are doing something that I think single case studies like the ones that we tend to do in literary circles don't do. That is, allow to in fact collect databases and understand statistically what is going on within and between languages. And I think as literary scholars, because here we're sort of, I think we're talking as and both literary scholars and translators, and I put myself in both those camps, there is something to be said, or there is something that needs to be articulated further in order to avoid the kinds of sort of impressionism or anecdotal part of the case studies to be said about the corpus, the need to understand things a little more statistically as to how these intertextual relations okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just respond to a couple of these points, these very important points, quickly. First of all, although, yes, I'm working with ideas that go back to the beginning of my work. I mean, I think my work generally has been fascinated by or obsessed with what distinguishes a translated text as a text in its own right, related to, undoubtedly, the source text, dependent on the source text, by definition. But certainly, I use the term relative autonomy, which also comes from Althusser to a certain extent, to talk about this status of the translated text. But I'm not talking about, in this paper, I did not talk about foreignization or domestication. Okay? I'm talking about something actually that's more basic than that issue. What I'm suggesting is that every translation is an intertext. And that has not been studied much. That every translator, as soon as the translator writes a sentence, as soon as the translator writes a word, that sets up a whole network of intertextual connections that are specific to the translating language and culture. And we have not yet given enough attention to that. Even before we think about domestication, foreignization, whatever, there is this prior question. Translations construct intertextual networks. Okay, that's part of what makes them text in their own right. And I would want to insist on that. The second point is that I was not actually trying to talk about what has happened to the unit of translation in contemporary or in translation research over the past decade, but the unit of analysis in translation research. What scholars are focusing on as constituting analytical evidence. And they include, for example, broad systemic trends. And that emphasis has obscured the translated text. Giselle Sapiro, has enormous statistics that are fascinating. They reveal a lot about what the status, what the position of translation is in the French literary system and the publishing industry. But okay, I mean, there are still individual texts that are doing this, and what is their impact? So I want to insist that we need not forget. We forget, at jeopardy, that the text is a unit of analysis. It's not the unit of translation, but the unit of analysis. I'm not simply interested in literary translation, I have to say. And I'd like to, once and for all, although I know I'm powerless to do this, to stop the reductive and oversimplifying distinction between literary translation on the one hand and technical or pragmatic translation on the other. What interests me most, I confess, is what I would call humanistic translation. And I would put in this category translation not only in the full gamut of the arts, but also the human sciences. That translation is happening in history, in anthropology, in religion, in philosophy, sociology, and we know so little about that. I mean, my attention to the translation of Timpanaro's text is a move in that direction. So I'm interested in humanistic text. I'm also interested, of course, in pragmatic text. I mean, the translation of travel guidebooks interests me. Why? I'm interested in translation where the translator has a broad range of choices to make. I'm interested mostly in translation where the translator is applying a complicated set of interpretants. The closer you get to technical translation, the more the interpretants are circumscribed. The translation of a pharmaceutical treatise, of a legal brief, of a real estate contract is an act of interpretation, I would insist. That to do that kind of translation, the translator has to apply interpretants. There's a third category, okay? Usually, however, it comes down to a formal interpretant, like the current standard dialect of the translating language. Another formal interpretant is a fairly standardized terminology, okay? And then, of course, there's the function, there's the social situation that limits the choices that a translator makes, because you got to produce a translation that will function, in that setting. So technical translators, I'm not demeaning them by any means. I want to argue that they too are performing acts of interpretation. It's just that the interpretants are more circumscribed, whereas the more you get, through pragmatic and humanistic translation, the more the spectrum of interpretants expands. Okay. Corpus linguistics, I have to say, is something that always provoked a kind of ambivalence in me. I mean, I think I participate in the euphoria of scientific evidence that we could finally learn something about language and translations and so forth. And back into the 90s when it was really getting underway, I gave my translations, to people who were doing research, and they were scanned into databases and so forth. I think the problems for me, in fact, I think you've described them. That it's valuable knowledge, and I think it's important to know, get the statistical data about what's happening, within and between languages through corpus linguistics. And certainly, this is one way that translation studies can increase its cachet in the academy, because suddenly digital humanities has emerged, especially in Anglophone countries, as a force to be reckoned with. It's pretty amazing. The Modern Language Association of America. Why don't they call it the Americas? Anyway, the Modern Language Association of America, the MLA, just appointed a new director of scholarly publications who's running the publication programs, and Kathleen Fitzpatrick, her name is, and she is one of the leading scholars in digital humanities. So what we consider corpus linguistics is finally invading, the literary field too. But Statistical data is one thing. Actual reading practices is another. And I don't want to sound like a Luddite here, but humans read books. Machines, all right, don't. Okay? Machines are not readers. And if we want to move translation and the awareness, the consciousness of translation, if we want its centrality to cultures to be recognized, we've got to train readers. We've got to deal with reading practices. We've got to realize that even the quantitative data we get from corpus linguistics still needs to be analyzed in cultural and social and historical terms. So that's my ambivalence. Thank you for getting me to say that. Bill Graves, please. Yeah.
That was terrific. I loved your emphasis back on the text as the focus of analysis, and your.
I'm a translator.
Yeah, and precisely. And your distinction between that and other kinds of analysis, one of which focuses on linguistics, and the other of which focuses on sociology and that sort of thing. Drawing on my gray beard, I want to look back to the late 1950s and so forth, when there was a flourishing in England of a kind of linguistic theory which didn't divorce linguistic analysis from social analysis and from the text. It's now called systemic functional linguistics. Halliday and that crew. And they use the term applied linguistics, not in the sense that we use it now, but in the sense of linguistics to solve social problems. And one of these social problems was translation. And out of that, it was a wonderful theory, which got swamped in 1960. But out of that came Catford's literary theory of translation, and I'm just wondering how your work might relate to that earlier flowering.
Yes, no, Halliday is unique. I mean, his work is truly amazing. The way he ranges over different disciplines, including literary disciplines. There's a great essay he wrote about subcultures that talks about underworld argos and so forth. And he uses text from the Elizabethan period. Amazing text called the Coney Catching Pamphlets. I don't know if anyone knows these, but it was an amazing piece that's simultaneously linguistic and literary and historical. So I think one of the problems for me is that period, the late 50s, it's true, it was so diverse in terms of the range of methodologies and approaches to translation. Jakobsen, his essay, it's only a brief essay. It's more tantalizing than, a developed or programmatic statement. But what he does with Charles Peirce in that has yet to be followed up, I think. And the work that's been done on semiotics in translation studies has been disappointing, I think, because it hasn't gotten us back to the text. And it's, in some kind of, speculative stratosphere. I think one of the sad things that happened is precisely the movement from Halliday to Catford. That what happened with Catford is that suddenly translation, first of all, was subsumed to linguistics. It was applied linguistics. But simultaneously, there was a narrowing of focus to not simply to language, divorced from cultural and social issues, but on manufactured examples. I mean, his book is useful. I mean, a linguistic theory of translation. But, he invents all these examples. Why not use real translations? So we've moved beyond that. But I think, there are paths not taken in translation studies. I'm a great admirer of Ian Mason's use of systemic functional linguistics. If anything, for me, Ian, tries to look at himself as, descriptive. So he won't, take that step that his evidence drives him to make, which is to say that, if you're going to analyze European Union documents and uncover all of these nationalist ideologies that are preventing people from resolving, political and social issues, you're politically engaged. And, to use transitivity is no longer descriptive. It's serving an ideological project. So I think, work in that vein is something that fascinates me. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks, first of all, for this amazing lecture. I know you have mentioned in your previous answers that you don't want to relate it to domestication and foreignization, but I have two burning questions that I couldn't
I haven't
not
given
address.
them up.
Yeah. I have just two short related questions. Does recontextualizing a text or constructing the intertextual relations and references in the translation is by default maybe a domestication in some way or another? And let's say if my method, if I was a pro foreignization, would recontextualizing a text contradict this method of foreignization or no?
Okay, thank you. Shukran. I think that, first of all, I have to say that, just to be clear, let's get really basic. All translation is domestication, in my sense, insofar as it involves rewriting a source text in terms that are intelligible and interesting in a receiving situation, another culture. Translation is domestication. Okay? However, there's still a choice because any receiving situation is very heterogeneous. There are a range of values. There are a range of linguistic practices. They happen to be arranged hierarchically with some values, some practices accruing more cultural and social authority than others. And if the translator keeps on assimilating source materials to what is dominant in the receiving situation, that is a kind of domestication I want to question. Okay? Since that reaffirms, reinforces the status quo. And my whole idea is that translation is about linguistic and cultural difference. That's what translation is by definition. It traffics in linguistic and cultural differences. These linguistic and cultural differences call translation into being and function. And therefore, translation should shake things up. If it's not doing that, it's no longer translation. It's propaganda. It's reinforcing the status quo. Okay? Insofar as all translation enacts this recontextualizing process, then, the translator, depending on, of course, who the client is, who is hiring the translator, I don't want to minimize the real situation. Luckily, I don't have to make a living from translation. Okay? That's why I could insult publishers, and say, I'm not going to let you touch my translation and so forth. I fight with publishers, Right. But in this recontextualizing process, a recontextualization can be done, to maintain the hierarchy of the linguistic and cultural hierarchy in a receiving situation, or it could challenge it in a variety of ways. These ways, are not simply linguistic. They could be the very choice of a source text. It really means in getting a sense of where the receiving situation is. Translators need to be more than just language technicians. They need to look at themselves as cultural and social workers who have a sense of what their culture is, not simply what the source culture is. I want to go further. Okay? I want to look at the translator as a kind of writerly intellectual. Don't be frightened. Okay? But I want to conceive of this intellectual along the lines of Edward Said's notion of what an intellectual is. And that is someone who's constantly raising questions, someone whose work is not quiescent, who's not affirming the status quo, but constantly being the bad conscience of the status quo. And fomenting change, ultimately. Innovation, experiment. I think this is what translation has the power to do. Okay. Thank
Okay, thank you very much for your enlightenment. And my question or my questions, which are two in number, will be a bit different from the predecessors, simply because I put the questions more as a practitioner rather than a theorist of translation. And I put the questions about notions or translations that pertain to ideologically or politically loaded expressions, mainly or precisely terrorists versus freedom fighter. Before I put my question proper, I would like to, again, to hopefully help you understand my stand, mention 3 dates. I'll talk about 1967, not in Golan as you may think, but in Zimbabwe, which was South Rhodesia then. The second I will talk about is 1999 in Kosovo, and the third would be 2010 in Burundi/Canada. I'm from Burundi myself. 1967 because I happened to talk with a retired British-born engineer who was serving in then Rhodesia in 1967, and as he was showing me his pictures then, I remember him stumbling, stopping about telling, here I was fixing my flat tire and I was very frightened because I might have been attacked by, then he stopped, well, what was called then a terrorist, but I don't know how we'd be calling him now. That's enough with 1967. Now, 1999, I remember clearly what was being talked in the media, Western media, about, I may not have the exact translation, but the Kosovo Liberation Army. Before the bombing campaign in what was Yugoslavia, I think they were referred to, at least from the United States, as a terrorist organization. But a couple of years later, I think it was a liberation movement. And now, for 2010, and this brings me to my research, I translate the corpus in Kirundi, my mother tongue, spoken in Kirundi, where I have to do with about a dozen expressions, describing terrorist versus freedom fighter. Since 2010, that is when I'm busy translating this, I'm faced with a neo-existential question of being, well, a good translator. I have in mind my would-be thesis committee or jury. At the same time, a national of Burundi, and who has experienced what I've experienced, I have this same obligation to render as accurately as possible that reality. But also, I'm sure that when my thesis is finally bound, some other people will be reading it. So I have so many readers in mind. So by now, I think you understand where I'm coming from.
Absolutely.
Yes. So what would you advise to an academic or an aspiring academic translating in a context where he has to be, accurate vis-a-vis the academic requirements, not in the sense of politically correct, but neutral, I would say, but at the same time is faced with rendering realities that might be interpreted differently from, the readers.
Thank you. First of all, I've got to suggest that it's essential for you to abandon this distinction between theory and practice. Everything you said shows that that distinction is questionable, that your practical decisions are loaded with theoretical issues. Or, again, to get more basic, there can't be a translation practice without a translation theory. Okay? I think one of the most naive deceptions of translation is that, you just sit down and you start, typing up your translation before the source text, and therefore there are only 2 texts involved here. But in translation, it takes 3 to tango. Okay? There's always this third category that enables the translation to be produced. Without that third category, no translation can occur. Okay, what is this third category? It's actually very complicated. I'm calling it a set of interpretants. But at the most basic level, a translator needs to decide what concept of equivalence he or she is going to apply in order to move from the source text to the translation. Otherwise, there's no basis on which for you to choose alternatives or so-called equivalents. Usually, the naive deception is, I'm just adhering to the dictionary. But a dictionary is a third category. You open up a bilingual dictionary, or even a monolingual dictionary, and you will see, depending on how common the word is in the language, you will see multiple meanings for that word, and you have to select them. So the first category, the first third here, is the dictionary. You open a dictionary, then you have multiple examples. You need to make a set of assumptions to decide how you're going to exclude some of these. It could be the context or whatever, but you need a concept of equivalence, at the very least. You also need a concept of style to do a translation. It may come down to an assumption about what constitutes good writing, generally speaking. But translators, mobilize these assumptions. I'm trying to make them more precise by calling them interpretants. Interpretant, of course, is a word I'm getting from Charles Peirce, from semiotics. Okay. It strikes me that what you're encountering, finally, is that you have a particular concept of equivalence that your academic advisors may not share. That for you, the word in the Burundi, in the African language, should be translated as freedom fighter. Whereas another concept of equivalence would insist that it's terrorist. And there may be other possibilities. Okay? Which is to say that concepts of equivalence are not politically innocent. They can be ideologically loaded. So, short of bribing your advisors, what I suggest is that you, first of all, study Gideon Toury. This is the theorist that will help you most, because the great thing about Gideon's work is that he showed, in an unmistakable way, in the late 70s, that concepts of equivalence are culturally and socially variable. That they vary, first of all, over time. They're always defined in a receiving culture for Gideon. But they also vary between historical periods, but within the same historical period, according to different cultural constituencies, different political groups, and so forth. How to decide between them? That's a philosophical problem. You can't escape theory. But finally, it comes down to, as in many, or all, I would say, acts of humanistic projects, it comes down to acts of interpretation for which the interpreter tries to build a consensus of agreement. So you've got to lay out your theory, and you've got to hope that you can persuade your advisors. Otherwise, you can always transfer it to another school. Any other questions? I can go on.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I have a question about your point number 1 and 2 about Melissa F's translation. I was really impressed by how you chose to substitute the jargon of the book with John Cleland's range of words. But it seems to me that point number 2 is such a different choice from point number 1, right? That you're presenting two different strategies. And it seems to me that point number 1, when you translate mite as gentle, tame, and meek, and make a connection to another text, this is, of course, to me, it goes way beyond how you choose to translate a different
a jergo with another jergo, because in point number one you're adding something, right? So to me this is a little bit of a writer taking over, at least this is my perception, and it seems to me that it confers a complexity that the Italian text does not have. And when you were explaining, introducing this choice, you mentioned that there is intertextuality within the Italian text as well, because Melissa goes to school, takes Greek, and mentions Dante and so on. But I would say that those are references which are universal for an Italian teenager, and I wonder how universal your gentle, tame, and meek would be for an American reader. If this is a genuine question, I really don't know. So my point is, how can we prevent the writer taking over in a translation? What are the boundaries? I guess the boundaries are very ill defined here. But the way that I see to answer this is perhaps, well, you spoke about knowledge of the target culture, right? Like if you have to know the culture into which you translate very well, but you also have to know the source culture very, very well. And I wonder if can translation ever be an individual task? Like, does any person know so well two cultures as well as two languages, or do you also collaborate when you translate?
Thank you. This will give me an opportunity to clarify some basic points. First of all, I have to say that I find the notion that of adding, the translation might be adding things, a little weird, because you realize that every word in the translation is an addition to the source text. Maybe I should say that again. Okay? That every word in the translation is not in the source text. Okay? So there's a sense in which the entire translation is an addition, even when the translator looks up every word in the source text in a dictionary and finds his or her equivalent, there is still an addition. Okay? They weren't chosen by the author. I mean, you can describe the addition in a lot of ways. They are not authorized. Okay? I think that's very important to acknowledge. The second thing is that the notion that translating one word in the source text with three words as somehow, breaking a taboo, I think, needs to be approached with a great deal of caution. Translators are constantly translating more than one word in the source text with one word in the translation, and vice versa. Okay? I mean, if you're a translator, I'm describing your practice. You must recognize this. If you don't, you're not being honest. Okay? The structural differences between languages are such that you can't have a one-to-one correspondence. This is basic, isn't it? Okay. All right. Let me get a little more complicated. The notion that picking this allusion or creating the intertextual connection that is not in the source text somehow betrays Melissa's intention, or the Italian text creates two problems. One is, in translation, we know that there is a phenomenon called compensation. It's not always possible to produce an effect that the translator perceives in the source text at exactly the same point in the translation. But you may be able to get it somewhere else. Is that an addition? In translation, it's called a compensation. It's considered acceptable. But there's a deeper problem here. And that is, I'm concerned that notions of adding things as a taboo, the translation adds things, or adding words, or not respecting the source text, is ultimately an instrumentalism. It ultimately assumes that the source text is a container of invariance, formal invariants, semantic invariants, invariant effects. And that is just not true, even in the source culture. That Melissa's text was read in multiple ways in Italy. It was variable in Italy. If we're going to change the language, it's got to be variable in the other language. Okay? This notion of instrumentalism, I'm arguing, is really a hoax. There is no invariant in the source text. And translation exposes that in a troubling way, which may be one reason why translation is so marginalized, so misunderstood, so stigmatized. Okay. It's funny you should mention whether I should have translated Melissa into language and cultural values, whatever, that were universal for U.S. Teenagers. There were a whole list of words that my editor, for this was Grove Atlantic, wanted me not to use. And they included things like trousers. I couldn't use trousers, okay? I had to use pants. I couldn't say the day was lovely. I had to say the weather was beautiful. So, and there was a whole list of these things. I mean, some of them were understandable. I couldn't use mobile. I had to use cell for a phone, okay? It's a U.S. audience, this seems not a big problem to me. But I asked her about these other things. Why do I have to do that? And she said, well, because American teenagers don't talk that way. They don't use trousers. You have to use pants. Of course, if you use pants in the UK, it means underwear or whatever, so you have to be careful. But my response was, okay, but an American teenager didn't write this book. So why should I assimilate it to what American teenagers do and say? This editor wanted me to put in the word totally. That's an American teenage vernacular, totally. I hated that totally. So that's what I was dealing with, and I resisted that as much as I could, through a variety of things. The question of what boundaries then are constructed, for the translator. I would suggest that, with this kind of question, we are really dealing in the realm of ethics. And we're way beyond, I need to say, a business ethics, if you don't find that paradoxical. The notion, of course, that if you sign a contract, you should meet the deadline, you should, honor your client's wishes and so forth. That kind of ethics, we're way beyond that in raising this issue of boundaries, I want to suggest, because there are larger questions about showing respect. This is the way the French theorist Antoine Berman would have articulated the problem. Showing respect through the handling of the foreign text toward the foreign author and culture. But, this can easily devolve into, elevating literalism as the most ideal strategy, and that's what happened with Berman in many of his texts. I've tried to create a set of boundaries that I would describe, first of all, as interpretive. My choices are not arbitrary. I cite evidence on the basis of the source text. The texts that I picked reflect a certain literary quality, a certain effort to cite canonical texts in the Italian text. And I would suggest that I am developing an analogous way to honor that stylistic feature of the source text. But finally, for me, the ethical question is not adhering closely to the source text. That question needs to be adjudicated according to the use that the translation is going to serve and what readerships, will consume it and so forth. For me, I think ultimately the ethics comes down to making a difference in the receiving culture. In other words, to do right abroad, the translator needs to do wrong at home. And I think it's important to replace an ethics of respect, as it's been formulated anyway, with an ethics of innovation. Or the only way to show respect to a foreign text and culture is to give it an afterlife where it has new readers and means something in a different language and culture. It's a different kind of ethics. Thank you so much for putting up with me.